Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. We would like to thank our media sponsor, KCPW, for recording and rebroadcasting our forums as part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. Today's forum is a conversation with Senator Mike Lee. Senator Lee was first elected in 2010 as Utah's 16th U.S. Senator. Senator Lee graduated from Brigham Young University with a degree in political science and served as BYU's student body president his senior year. He graduated from BYU's law school in 1997 and went on to serve as law clerk to Judge D. Benson in the U.S. District Court for the District of Utah, and then with his future Supreme Court Justice Samuel A. Alito Jr. on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. And through his campaign, state, and D.C. offices, Senator Lee has hosted dozens of Hinckley interns. Today's discussion will be moderated by Jason Perry, the director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. And if you have any questions, please enter them into the YouTube chat, and we'll have time for those towards the end of our discussion today. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Jason.
All right. Thank you, Jack. Much appreciated. Senator Lee, so glad to have you with us today to spend a few minutes talking to us, to our students. And we have students from all over campus and turns out from all over the place tuning in today to listen to this conversation with you. Just so glad you're willing to do it. For those of you who are watching, as Jack just mentioned, we're looking closely for the questions. So Senator has agreed we're going to talk for a few minutes, and he's agreed to take some questions from our students and from the audience. So just enter those into the YouTube chat, and we'll catch them, and they'll be sent over to me so we can make sure we get those to the senator. Senator Lee, before I start asking you a few questions, you mind taking just a couple of minutes? Just address our group, and then I've got some specific topics I'm hoping to talk about that are of great interest to our students.
Sure. Thanks so much, Jason. Really is a pleasure to be with you. It's an honor to be introduced by Jack, the son of the great Kurt Jowers, former director of the Hinckley Institute and a longtime friend of mine. It's a great family, and pleasure to be here with you, Jason. I've known Jason for a long time. He and I worked together in the Huntsman administration. I've always been a big fan of his. Had a good visit recently with Jason Perry and with Taylor Randall, the new president of the university, when they came back to Washington a few weeks ago. We had a good visit on all sorts of issues confronting higher education and our country in general, and look forward to watching a football game with them here in a few weeks. So this is a very kind invitation of yours to extend to me, and I thank you for letting me talk to you today. I want to talk to you at the outset about a few of my legislative priorities, a few things that I've been working on before we launch into a broader discussion. There are a few bills that are kind of interesting that I thought you might be interested in. One that I've introduced quite recently in the last few weeks is a big multi-year bipartisan project, a bill that I've introduced with two of my Democratic colleagues, Chris Murphy from Connecticut and Bernie Sanders from the great state of Vermont. It's called the National Security Powers Act. And what it attempts to do is to reclaim territory that's been forfeited by the legislative branch. That is the branch of the federal government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. It's in charge of making law, in charge of appropriating funds, in charge of declaring war. Over time, under the leadership of Republican and Democratic Congresses and White Houses, we've seen this accretion of power in the executive branch, a voluntarily voluntarily undertaken active relinquishment of legislative powers, including and especially the power to declare war over the executive branch. Last year, Senator Sanders and I, working together with Senator Murphy, introduced the first ever use of the War Powers Act that ended up succeeding with a resolution to get us out of the unconstitutional, undeclared civil war in Yemen. Unfortunately, President Trump vetoed that act, and we tried to override it. We were unsuccessful in doing so, but we resolved at the time that we were going to reform the War Powers Act and make it more difficult for war to be waged without congressional authorization. So we combined an overhaul of the War Powers Act together with an overhaul of the National Emergencies Act and some efforts to reclaim some of our powers related to those things into one bill called the National Emergency Powers Act. We've had some good discussions with members of both political parties about this over the last few weeks. And just 2 or 3 weeks ago, Senator Murphy and I went over to the White House and met with Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, about some of these provisions. And we're working to get some of them adopted, we hope, into the next round of the National Defense Authorization Act. Stay tuned on that one. That's a fun one. As always, I continue to work on criminal justice reform, as I have ever since I came to the Senate in 2011. For a long time, this was a project that didn't have enough support on the Republican side of the aisle to go anywhere. For a long time, it was just me and a bunch of fairly liberal Democrats. Initially, it was me and Dick Durbin from Illinois. About a year or so later, Cory Booker came to the Senate. And when he did, the very first conversation I had with him, he introduced himself and said, "I want to work with you on criminal justice reform." It took us about 8 years, but we ended up passing the most successful and the most dramatic overhaul of the federal criminal justice system in many decades. We overhauled the federal sentencing system. We also overhauled the manner in which people can work to earn good time credit. Our goal was to make the criminal justice system fairer and more effective and more efficient. You know, one of the things that prompted me to get into this was that I saw, as a former prosecutor, what happens when you have minimum mandatory sentences in the federal system that are sometimes really excessive in relation to the harmfulness of the activity involved. There was a young man who was prosecuted while I was a prosecutor, not by me, but by someone else in my office. A young man named Weldon Angelos, who was in his mid-20s at the time. He was the father of 2 young children. He got involved in some illegal activity and ended up selling 3 dime bags of pot to what turned out to be a confidential informant. Because of the way he was charged and because he had a gun on his person at the time, a gun that was neither brandished nor discharged in connection with the offense, Mr. Angelos was subject to a minimum mandatory sentence under the federal system of 55 years. The judge sentencing him, former federal district judge Paul Cassell, now a fantastic professor at the University of Utah, took the extraordinary step of issuing a sentence issuing an opinion disagreeing with the sentence he was about to impose. He said there are all sorts of criminals, including murderers, hijackers, terrorists, kidnappers who don't get this much time in prison, and yet I've got no choice but to sentence this young man to a sentence that'll take him into his 80s. And then he said something that would haunt me. He said, "Only Congress can fix this problem." And I took that to heart. When I ended up in the Senate years later, I decided to push for that. And that, in a nutshell, is what got me interested in this and what led many years later to the passage of the First Step Act. Dick Durbin and Cory Booker and I, along with many others, are not finished. In fact, we're just getting started. We're still working on more criminal justice reform as well. Got some other things I'd love to talk to you about later if we get a chance in our conversation about global trade accountability. Always looking for ways in which we can restore to Congress the power to make laws, including the power to make trade decisions that can start a trade war. It's often said that there are no winners in war, only losers. It is certainly true with trade wars. When you start a trade war, everyone loses, and we need to make it harder, not easier to do that. The Global Trade Accountability Act would require that. But look forward to talking to you more about these and other matters, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great introduction. These are some very significant pieces of legislation you're working on, have worked on for some time. You mind if I dig into a couple of those? Because
please do.
There's some pieces of it that I know our students are interested in. But I should say, as people and our students get to know you even better through this forum, when it comes to topics of the law, I did have this one experience with you that I'll just bring up, which I thought was great. I was in your office in Washington, D.C., and someone said, Senator Mike Lee may be the only person in all of Congress that knows the law of the sea. You remember we talked about that? It just gives an idea of the breadth.
At the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. That's it's important to know its provisions.
See, it's just impressive. It just shows the breadth of your knowledge there too. But I want to get into a couple of these key items and maybe just go in reverse order a little bit. As a former prosecutor myself, who actually took criminal law from Paul Cassell when he was before I went to the court for a while. We talked a lot about these mandatory minimums, but there's some pieces on this that I think were interesting for our students as well. One to do with Pell Grants and how those are impacted by people who have been incarcerated. Maybe talk about that a little bit too, because that directly impacts some segment of the population.
Yeah, exactly. Starting about, I think it was about 25 years ago, members of Congress decided that it was not acceptable to make prisoners eligible to participate in the Pell Grant program. Prisoners are easy scapegoats to blame for all sorts of things. And I think some people jumped on board with that and said, yeah, take those away. One of the problems with that is, this is one of the ways that we reduce crime rates, is making sure that when a prisoner completes his or her term in prison, that the prisoner has marketable skills to engage in lawful activity. We find that if people have such marketable skills, and if they have an education of some sort, they're far less likely to return to a life of crime. And so that's why I'm one of the leading sponsors of a bill to undo that restriction.
On this First Step Act, maybe we just talk about how this works. I was a former prosecutor myself, and the U.S. Attorney's Office. And for those that are not as familiar with this, you have your crime, and there's a sentencing guideline book, right? So you go and just kind of start adding up your points. And so it really is like, what's the crime? What are the aggravating factors? Certain things that you can talk about that's there. And it's just a reality. You get to this end, and regardless of the circumstances or the uniqueness of the case before you, out pops the number. This is how long you need to be incarcerated for. I'm curious about because that's historically how it's been done. And I'm just curious how your colleagues are receiving that, and if they're being persuaded by the arguments you just gave about not only do you need to look at the circumstance of the case, but about the reform aspects of the people who come before the court.
Yeah, they're more sympathetic to these concerns, certainly, than they were a few decades ago. Between the mid 80s and the late 90s, Congress went through an awkward stage, as Congresses often do, but it went through a stage where everyone was trying to outdo everyone else. Everybody wanted to be the tough on crime senator or the tough on crime representative or president. And it became popular in both political parties from people all over the country, regardless of their political ideology, to want to be the person that says, yeah, lock them up, throw away the key, and put in 6 extra locks, make sure they don't ever get out. That, I guess, was scratched a particular itch at the time politically, but it wasn't very good policy. It wasn't terribly productive, because it didn't take into account what that does to the person. Locking someone up and just institutionalizing them on a long-term basis is something that ought to be avoided wherever it can. I mean, obviously there are some offenses that are so grave in their nature or so repeated that the person might not ever be able to be trusted to go outside again unless they present a constant threat to public safety, everyone around them. That's not most prisoners. The overwhelming majority of all prisoners haven't committed an offense or even a pattern of offenses that would or that should disqualify them from ever returning to civilization again outside of prison. So that being the case, you've got to figure out what amount of time they ought to serve versus not serve. Now, there are 2 parallel considerations here. Jason, you referred to the sentencing guidelines, and that is one track. Most sentences, it's a little different from state to state, and the federal sentencing system is very different than the Utah state court criminal justice laws and the sentencing system. In Utah, we have a modified indeterminate system, which is that the statute will indicate for this type of an offense, you're going to get a period of time of at least one and no more than 15 years for a particular offense. They'll give some broad range like that. And then the Board of Pardons and Parole will have these regular, typically annual review periods in which they'll review each prisoner and decide how much longer they need to stay in prison. It's not how it works in the federal system. We have more or less a modified determinate system where the judge imposes a certain number of months in which you'll serve prison time. Most of those sentences are guided by these federal sentencing guidelines. The judge will plug in your criminal history points, and the nature of your offense, and it's almost algorithmic. The judge will end up coming up with a sentence that's like, 64 to 73 months, and they'll impose it somewhere in that range. And then subject to good time release, that's more or less going to be the sentence that's imposed. Minimum mandatory sentences are different than that, in that there are some statutes that before you even get to the quasi-discretionary judgment call that the sentencing judge can make, it takes all that away, and that says regardless of what the sentencing guidelines would otherwise impose, for this type of an offense, you must impose a sentence of not less than, in the case of Weldon Angelos, 55 years. And that's one of the problems that we were trying to address with the First Step Act, was that we identified some of those areas where the statutory minimum mandatory sentence was excessive.
We're watching this one closely. It's so interesting. I know our professors here at our law school are watching this one closely and working with you also, which we appreciate. A couple questions on the first item you mentioned on the war powers, because this is it's very ripe. It's what you're talking about right now. We've read some articles, some quotes from you recently. Maybe take a second to highlight the fact that this is not a partisan issue anymore. Maybe talk a little bit about that, how you got your counterparts on the other side of the aisle, even Bernie Sanders, together with this particular issue, and talk about why after, as I've read some articles from you, like 50 plus years of talking about this, we might actually be at a point where Congress itself is willing to reclaim that war powers authorization that they have by Constitution.
Yeah, over the last few decades, we've had wars that have lasted way too long. And we've had other military excursions that our government has been reluctant to identify as wars. And because it's been unwilling to identify them as wars, it's justified them as something else. In the meantime, this unholy alliance of the military-industrial complex and executive branch officials and legislative branch officials have tended to make it easier and easier to either initiate conflict, often either identifying it as a non-war military action, when there are a lot of things that amount to an act of war and probably should be authorized by Congress that fit within that, or alternatively, they'll shoehorn an act of war or an ongoing military effort in a foreign land on foreign soil using U.S. military resources as somehow necessary and incident to an existing authorization for the use of military force. We've had two long-lasting AUMFs over the last 2 decades, one authorizing military action in Afghanistan, the other in Iraq. And my daughter Eliza is now a junior in college. She was an infant at the time those wars started. She's now a junior in college. They've lasted that entire time, nearly the entire duration of her life. And not only that, but those authorizations for the use of military force have been used ostensibly as justification for military excursions elsewhere in the region, in places like Syria, Yemen, Libya, and parts of Africa. And this really isn't acceptable. Jason, as to the part of your question where you asked, how did I bring people from across the other side of the aisle? That was actually the easiest part. Democrats on the whole have been better on this issue than Republicans have. My party, lamentably, has over time included a lot of people who have almost been willing to wear as if it were a badge of honor, the party of the war drum. I don't like that element within my party. I don't like that aspect of my party, and I don't think that's what my party ought to stand for. In any event, we've long had a number of Democrats who were war reluctant. Fortunately, it's now becoming a bipartisan endeavor where we've got a number of Republicans who are seeing the light on the fact that war is a tragic choice. It's something you hope not to have to do. Sometimes it's necessary, but it's a necessary evil at times. But that's why we make it really, really difficult to go to war. You don't want to make it too easy. It's one of the things that was identified by our founding generation as the differentiator between our form of government and the one that we left, based in London. It was Alexander Hamilton who wrote about this in Federalist number 69, in which he pointed out that under our London-based national government, the one that we broke away from, the executive, that is the monarch, the King of England, King George III at the time, had the power unilaterally to declare war, to get us into war. It was then up to their legislative branch, the parliament, to figure out how to pay for it. But it was the monarch's decision as the executive to make that decision and to declare that war. We made a decided choice not to do that, because in our system, the sovereign wasn't the monarch. The sovereign was the people. So they gave it to the branch of government that's most accountable to the sovereign, meaning to the people.
What is the reception you're getting from the White House itself? Sometimes you start talking about reclaiming power that maybe has been taken over a period of time. What are you receiving right now from the White House in terms of your actions, your comments and actions?
This is the best reception we've gotten so far since I've been here since 2011. So I've served in the Senate under 3 different presidents of the United States, Obama, and then Trump, and of course now Biden. Generally speaking, this administration has given us a better reception on these issues than we had in the past. Both President Obama and President Trump were war reluctant in many respects, but they were also very reluctant to do anything that could be perceived by anyone, including the legislative branch, as a relinquishment of this accretive power over war making and actions like unto war within the executive branch. I was absolutely elated, though, when we finished meeting with Jake Sullivan. Remember, he's the national security advisor to President Biden. He's the person talking to the president. Anyone holding that position is the person consulting the president during these times of crisis. Anytime there are national security issues, the national security advisor is in there leading the way with the president. Is definitely the warmest reception we've received when we've discussed the need for legislative reform of the war-making process. It's not to say that others were hostile to it. Jake Sullivan's predecessor, Robert O'Brien, who served in the Trump administration, is a dear friend and is a defender of the Constitution and of liberty. And he was sympathetic to these views as a whole as well. But I feel like President Biden, having served in the Senate for about 40 years, and also served as the president of the Senate, as the vice president, he is very familiar with this issue and with this tug of war. And he's been more sympathetic than what we could have hoped or imagined.
Yeah, sometimes when you have experience on both sides of this one, it does inform where you are now. So very interesting. I'll watch that one closely. You alluded to a little bit of your work on trade, which I think is just such an important thing right now. A resolution, in fact, you've been working on recently, a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom. Maybe talk about what you're doing right there and why, and maybe why that particular location, but what's so important about establishing these free trade agreements. And this is the time for us to be talking about that without question.
Since the late 1920s and early 30s. I believe it started during the Herbert Hoover administration, but certainly continued on through FDR and essentially every subsequent president. We've seen Congress delegating out its power to set trade barriers of one sort or another, tariffs and other import restrictions. Mm-hmm. We've seen those being delegated out to the executive branch. Sometimes they'll be delegated out to the president specifically, other times to another official or another office within the executive branch. Here again, both parties have been equal opportunity offenders. Both parties have delegated that out and then allowed presidents to not just take the lead, but essentially make the law in this area. And trade wars are a little bit like hot wars in that trade wars have devastating consequences. Sometimes they may be necessary, although as with hot wars, I think trade wars are very, very rarely unavoidable and almost always should be avoided. And no one ever wins a trade war. They're only losers in them. So there's been this accretion of power within the executive branch, and with it, you've seen the people's elected lawmakers whose job it is under Article 1, Section 8, to establish this policy. Members of both houses and both political parties have said, yeah, that's it, we'll hand it over to the executive branch. This creates a couple of problems. It does give the president too much power that no one person was ever intended to have. But it also gives a degree of political insulation, that is a lack of accountability to the people whose job it is to do that. So members of Congress have over time delegated out in pieces all this trade policy authority, the power to start a trade war to the executive branch. And then when it doesn't go well, as it usually doesn't, and members of Congress will say, oh, I'm outraged. And they'll write a strongly worded letter to the US Trade Representative or to the Department of Commerce or the Secretary of the Treasury or the President himself. And this doesn't make sense. And so what we try to do with the Global Trade Accountability Act is to identify a dozen or so of these provisions where we've outsourced the authority. And we've said, okay, let's start with that in mind. But once a decision is made on the executive branch side on any one of these issues, we'll take that as a legislative proposal and one that ought to receive fast-track consideration in Congress. We'll give it a binary up or down vote, subject ultimately to signature or veto by the President of the United States. That would put the American people back in charge of their own trade policy again, and it would take away this plausible deniability that we've seen. As to the United Kingdom, since Brexit happened, I felt it important to make sure that we have a bilateral trade agreement with what has been our closest economic and military ally for a long time, the United Kingdom. The Biden administration is looking more and more receptive to this idea all the time, and I look forward to getting that done.
Some things that have happened with you recently, I want to talk about that gets right to some of these social media platforms our students are on. I watched with great interest. You had a chance, you got to grill some executives. You had, the big wigs, the TikTok, Snapchat, YouTube, others. And maybe talk about what you did there, because it talks about how they're influencing young people in particular. But you took an interesting next step, your office, in creating an account. Maybe talk about what you did right there to get a view of what youth today are getting from our social media and how they responded to some of your questions there. I found it to just be really interesting.
Yeah, we set up a fake Snapchat account purporting to be a 15-year-old girl. Just entered the bare necessary information, name, birth date, one or two other things. Maybe they knew nothing else about the supposed child than that. We wanted to see what would happen. The Discover feature on the Snapchat app, which provides something of a feed, is sort of like a news feed, then started sending content to that identity, that supposed 15-year-old girl, it was not exactly age appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
Two articles among the very first things that arrived included not just one, but two articles about porn stars, some type of post describing the fact that you should never go to a bar alone, or one or two advertisements for adult-themed video games that were pornographic and sexually explicit. These aren't things that are appropriate for a child. They're not things that are appropriate for an underaged user, and yet that's exactly what happened. And so Snapchat, which had literally just finished telling us that that sort of thing shouldn't happen, when I brought this up with the Snapchat representative, she appeared surprised. But these things are happening. It's all done through a system of algorithms. They are theirs, and they have yet to give me answers on exactly how that happened or why. But we know that there are significant profit incentives that these companies have in order to bring people in, and when you're dealing with underage users, you've got a certain responsibility. Mm-hmm. Make sure you're speaking the truth to your customer base, to your adult consumers, and to your underage consumers, and the parents of those underage consumers, who tend to take the content moderation policies and the other terms of service offered up to the user base. They tend to take them seriously. They ought to be able to do that. One of many reasons why I've introduced something called the Promise Act. Mm-hmm. The Promise Act is a relatively simple reform that deals with online interactive services, including social media platforms and search engines. When they set their terms of service and things like their content moderation policies, if they stick to those, they should be fine. But if they promise you one thing and do another, if they promise that they're not going to send content that's not age appropriate to a child, and then they do that, that's a problem. Likewise, if they promise they're not going to discriminate against their user base based on criteria that they identify as out of bounds, and then they do that, that's a problem. What I mean by that is if they say they will do X and they do Y and not X, that is a deceptive trade practice. And the Promise Act would designate such deviations from their policies as deceptive business practices in violation of the Federal Trade Commission Act, Section 5, and would allow the FTC to take action under that. This is one step, but it's an important step, and a step that really I want to make sure gets taken.
One of the others, just an issue associated with this one, is you all recently had a chance to talk to some executives from Facebook about some, have a couple of whistleblowers coming before Congress talking about things they knew that may be happening that may have been harmful to youth, primarily young girls. And then it kind of got into a corollary too about impacts on politics and messaging we all receive. Tell me what those dialogues are that you're having there. I guess the public ones we're seeing, the private ones, because I know you're looking into these things as well. And where do you see this going?
Yeah, one of the many issues that we've got here is that right now there's not a lot of upward mobility among would-be competitors in this space. You've got a certain lack of competition that's insulating some of them from the natural market forces that might otherwise penalize people for mistreating their users one way or another, whether it's discriminating against certain political viewpoints or religious viewpoints, or discriminating against people based on geographic issues or whatever. It's the kind of thing that you tend not to do to your user base if you're concerned about market competition. Mm-hmm. And it's accelerated by the fact that there's now evidence indicating that Facebook, for example, has over the last decade undertaken a strategy consistent with acquiring would-be nascent competitors in an effort to maintain their monopoly position. Remember, it's not a violation of our federal antitrust laws to be a monopolist. What is unlawful is to acquire or to maintain monopoly status through anti-competitive conduct. And if you're out there acquiring nascent competitors with that objective in mind, saying, you know, this company or that company has some technology, has a platform that's gaining momentum, we've got to acquire them before they can present any meaningful competition to them. This is one of many ways you can violate the antitrust laws. There are all sorts of indications that some of these companies may have crossed the line into violating our antitrust laws one way or another. And so I think that's one direction in which you can see them being taken. Another direction involves Section 230 of the Telecommunications Decency Act, passed in the late 1990s. There are a lot of people, including a lot of members of my own political party, who want to repeal Section 230, which provides a degree of immunity to online interactive service providers. A lot of people who want to get rid of this, to remove their immunity. I'm very reluctant to do that. To simply repeal it would probably exacerbate some of the anti-competitiveness problems, some of the anti-competitive environment that we are already seeing could compound that problem several-fold, because if you remove the type of immunity provided by Section 230 and you don't put anything in its place, you're not just tweaking it to, to update or modernize it, then you'll end up with a small handful of big corporate monoliths that already occupy a huge percentage of the market in this area, who will be able to compete, who will be able to afford to have a veritable army of lawyers on hand to defend itself against these suits and win. Whereas smaller nascent competitors, the same sort that they've been acquiring defensively in some circumstances, will have no shot at that. They get litigated to death before they're able even to walk on their own. So we got to be really concerned about that. Finally, I'm resistant to the impulse, because there is a lot of anger fomented against these companies. There are a lot of people who just want to shut them down, other people who want to say, let's just either shut them down or break them up or make their current business model unlawful. There are aspects of their current business models that may be unlawful and that are under review right now. There are others that you probably could look at for some legislation, some of which I'm now considering, but you've got to resist the impulse to act too aggressively against a company that you just happen to dislike, because that itself threatens competition and that itself can cause other problems.
Very, very interesting. Let's keep this regulation idea with a couple. We have a couple of questions from our audience. One I want to ask you, because I'm curious about it also. When it comes to cryptocurrency, for example, what kind of efforts are looking at there? Whether are these cryptocurrency, are they being manipulated in some way? Where do you see Congress intervening, if they do at all, in this particular aspect? Because I know a lot of people, particularly the younger generation, when you go on campus, you ask what people are investing in. It's these cryptocurrencies for sure. And so there's just a lot of questions about when the regulation may come. There's some, but what may come next? How do you see that going forward? Because there's going to be a lot of discussion in the next little while.
Yeah. Cryptocurrency is a fascinating technology, and the way it has evolved such that it bears many of the most desirable characteristics of other things that have been used in one way or another as a medium of exchange. Cryptocurrency, generally speaking, is easily transferable, easily verifiable, almost infinitely divisible under the right circumstances, and not readily subject to manipulative inflation. And so it has a lot of characteristics that could make it a very healthy, productive, promising medium of exchange for the future. There are things about it that scare people in Washington to death, sometimes with good reason. there are ways in which it could be manipulated because most people don't understand or have access to the means by which to verify whether something is accurate or phony. Some people fear that this could present a problem for fraud. But there are a lot of experts who point out that it's one of the beauties of the blockchain is that if you use a blockchain-based cryptocurrency, it creates a transparent, auditable record that you can use to track things. So I think it has a lot of promise as a means of exchange. Some of those who have been concerned about it lately are worried about the fact that it's not a currency. It's not identified as a currency. It's identified by the IRS as an asset, and as such, when it's transferred, to the extent it has changed value, if it's increased in value from the time the owner first acquired it, then you'd have to pay capital gains tax on the conversion, on the income that you gained between the time you bought it and the moment you sold or exchanged it. And I just met with some people from a Utah-based business today that are developing technologies to help people track and audit the records of cryptocurrency-based exchanges. And I think a lot of those issues can be worked out. Some of them came to the forefront about 2.5 months ago in the Senate, when the Senate was considering the bipartisan infrastructure package. And there were provisions put in place in there giving the IRS some authority to look into cryptocurrency-based exchanges. And it wasn't written in a manner that was terribly careful. So a lot of concerns have been raised about that. We're trying to work out the details of that and make sure that it doesn't crash and burn the cryptocurrency market, which is thriving. Yes. I don't have all the answers on this, but these are some of the major touch points. What do you do with the capital gains? And should they be deemed capital gains or not long term? Should we just make it a means of currency? But if you do that, there are a lot of people who are worried, with good reason, about what that might do to the status of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency.
Mm-hmm. I think this is just a fascinating area, and I can't wait to see how this evolves going forward. And thank you for kind of giving us some ideas of at least some of the big issues you're going to have to, there's some things you're going to have to tackle as a member of the Senate there as well. Do you mind taking a second about just hot news of the day, the Biden administration putting out some vaccine mandate requirements even today, as we've seen some of these coming out, but even a bigger step forward this afternoon. It impacts all of us, so the University of Utah, we're getting close to 90% vaccinated with our faculty and staff, but this is a big issue really on campus, but in the state of Utah as well, as to when these vaccine mandates come forward. Talk about what the president did today and some of your thoughts about that, through the Utah lens particularly.
Understandably, the president wants to increase the rate at which Americans are getting vaccinated. And I want to say at the outset, I've had the vaccine. My whole family's been vaccinated. I've encouraged everyone around me to get vaccinated. The vaccine is protecting hundreds of millions of people in America from the dangerous effects of COVID. So it's a good thing. And generally speaking, I think people ought to be vaccinated. The question is, what do you do with the exceptions? There are always going to be exceptions. At least there should be. There should be exceptions to the law. There are Americans who, for one reason or another, have religious or other closely, sincerely held moral objections to vaccines. I happen not to be one of those, but there are those who have them. People for whom it would require them to turn their back on a very sincerely long-held belief that they shouldn't be vaccinated. There are others who may have discrete medical conditions, chronic or acute, that might counsel against them having it. I'm not a doctor. I don't purport to know when that might be the case, but I've heard from many hundreds of Utahns in recent weeks, including many who have medical conditions that are such that have caused their doctors, board-certified medical doctors to advise them, at least for now, not to be vaccinated. In some cases, I've heard of this advice being given where somebody's got one or more severe autoimmune conditions, or in some cases, in some other cases. We'll leave it at that. I don't understand the science of it well enough to know, but I do know that there are a number of doctors who in some cases counsel against it. So what do you do with those people? What do you do generally when someone, for whatever reason, chooses not to be vaccinated? It's a poll conducted recently by Axios, a nationwide poll that concluded that only 14% of all Americans believe that the penalty for someone refusing to be vaccinated should be the loss of a job. Only 14% of Americans thus think that President Biden's approach is a fair one, because what he's saying is that, at least if you work for the federal government, for a company that has a contract with the federal government, with the armed forces, or if you work for any employer with more than 99 employees, that you must get vaccinated, and that if you don't get vaccinated, you're probably going to lose your job. Only 14% of Americans think that that's fair. It also just doesn't seem right to tell someone that, regardless of what their reasons are, even if they've got a legitimate medical or religious or other personal reason why they don't want to be vaccinated, that they're not going to be able to work to put bread on the table for their children. This is not right. I also think this is emblematic of the type of problem that we've seen, this accretion of power within the executive branch. I read the preliminary publicly released version. It hasn't been formally published in the Federal Register, but I started reading it's like a 500-page long interim final rule today. It cites its source of authority as, some legislation authorizing OSHA to put in place rules. That legislation that they cited is so broad as to give OSHA the power to do just about anything. And I think this is yet another example of Congress over time relinquishing its lawmaking power, because basically, if you read the provision that they've cited, if it gives them this authority at all, and let's assume for a moment that it does, it's tantamount to saying, OSHA, you can go and make whatever law you want to make the workplace safer. That's not really good law. That's not keeping Congress accountable. It's not the right way to do it. In any event, I think the policy is a bad one, because you don't want to fire people for getting vaccinated. I want more people to get vaccinated. I think nearly everyone should. The question is what to do with the exceptions. I don't think this is going to make those who are vaccine reluctant more likely to get the vaccine. In fact, I think it's going to have the opposite effect, and that it will have an adverse effect on public health.
Interesting. I'm really curious about this. They often talk about sort of the Utah way. I mean, you and I have talked about this in the past too. The Utahns have an approach to politics and policies in particular. I'm just really curious, now that you've been in the seat for a period of time and you've been in all these meetings, is this a true statement? When you're talking to your colleagues and you say, this is how we are doing it in the state of Utah, you pick an issue from immigration, even to air quality or public lands. How is that received? Is that just a reality right there? Have we increased our influence from people like you, of course, and the Senate, but as we're having more of an impact in DC?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, not everyone is going to agree on every matter of policy, and I think the Utah way very often refers to an approach in which we try to approach things, doing our best to understand opposing viewpoints, doing our best to understand competing concerns that others might have, and that approach, when undertaken faithfully, can, in many circumstances, lead to a better policy outcome, and a policy outcome that's more likely to be received by more people. No one person can claim to have universal knowledge of, or access to, or right to claim title to the Utah way, but it's like I say, it's an approach, it's an attitude, one that I think we all do well to embrace.
Yeah, I always think it's interesting when you hear elected officials not from our state reference the state of Utah. You even hear the president of the United States occasionally. President Trump did, Joe Biden. We've heard that happen as well. It's just very interesting to see. For a small state, it does seem like we're not forgotten in any event.
Oh no, we're not forgotten. I mean, part of being from a smaller state, and a smaller state that's as beautiful as ours, and a state where people are as nice as they are, it makes you want to be heard. It makes you want more people to have access to more of what they want and less of what they don't want. So yeah, I think we do punch above our weight.
Yeah, it does seem like that's the case. Will you talk for just a minute? We only have a couple minutes left, but just one more big hot, there's a bunch, but I know, but one I'm watching very closely. We have some stimulus packages. We have some things being talked about, infrastructure bills, et cetera, right now. Can you just give us and our students a flavor for what you're seeing right now, the likelihood of some of these being passed out, potential impacts for our state?
Yeah, so for about the last week straight, you've heard Speaker Pelosi say that she's very close to putting up the bipartisan infrastructure package that was passed by the Senate in August. She wants to put that up for a vote in the House of Representatives. She did that, I believe, last Thursday night or maybe last Friday, or she was preparing to put it up for a vote. It never actually happened. She apparently didn't have the votes at the time. I've heard rumors from some of my friends over in the House of Representatives today that there's a possibility it'll be coming up again today. Mm-hmm. I think we'll know whether they have the votes to pass it based on whether they actually schedule the vote to occur, because that hasn't happened yet. What you've got a kind of a rift within the Democratic Party between the progressives and the moderates. The progressives want a much bigger, more robust spending package with more new programs in it, a more aggressive approach. And the moderates, sort of led by my colleagues Kirsten Sinema from Arizona and Joe Manchin from West Virginia, are recognizing that we live in a time of great inflation. Inflation is the natural consequence of what happens when the United States of America, relying in part on the fact that we have the world's reserve currency, has been borrowing money on a scale that we haven't seen in a very, very long time, in some ways ever. Last year we brought in a record volume of revenue, a sum well in excess of $3 trillion. The problem is we spent $6.6 trillion. So all the money we brought in, we spent more than twice that sum. And more than half of what we spent was borrowed. When you borrow that much money that quickly, especially in an economy with the world's reserve currency and the way our system works, it has kind of the same effect as if you were just printing out an additional $3.6 trillion. We're on track to, match or possibly even exceed that this time around. Every time you do that, you're making the purchasing power of each dollar moving through the American economy a little bit less. And so if you imagine the American economy as a basket of goods and services, everybody's got to compete for the things in that basket with their dollars. And then if you imagine, trillions of new dollars just being printed out and distributed by the federal government in a single year, you can imagine how that could have some nasty effects. It could make the cost of everything go up. Now, if you're wealthy and well-connected, you can probably anticipate some of this. You can probably find a way to even get wealthier off of it. You make more money off of it. But if you're neither of those things, if you're a lower income or a middle income person or family, odds are pretty good that your income is going to remain about the same, but the purchasing power of each dollar that you make is going to go down, which means it's really going to hurt a lot on your bottom line. So anyway, it's one of the reasons why Senators Manchin and Sinema are so concerned. It's not they don't want to do good for the world. They're concerned about the harmful effects that it could have if we just keep printing money the way that we have been. Anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying there are these competing concerns. Manchin and Sinema really want the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed, and the more progressive elements of the Democratic Party in the House and in the Senate would like a much larger spending bill and don't want the bipartisan infrastructure package to pass unless or until the much larger reconciliation package passes. I'm not sure how this one gets resolved. Yeah. For about the last 3 months, I've been thinking they were just days away from reaching a deal. Not sure that's true anymore. And there are elements within the Democratic Party that I think are feeling dispirited by the results of Tuesday's election in Virginia that is causing additional discontent and disarray. So bottom line is we could see a vote on the bipartisan infrastructure package within the next 24 hours. Okay. Right now, I wouldn't bet on it.
Okay. Okay. I've been wondering, watching the news, trying to see come out, but I just unique to be able to get your insider's perspective on that, because of course that has huge impacts for all of us. So Senator Lee, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. These are some big issues we talked about. Wow. Huge consequence, each one of them. Appreciate you there representing us and for taking the time to talk to our students today. Thank you.